Over the past year and a half, we've had the pleasure of the company of James Bovard, who is not only a magnificent writer and has some terrific books out there already that I've recommended to you: Freedom in Chains and Lost Rights, Feeling Your Pain, The Bush Betrayal, Terrorism, Germany. I mean, there's just a nice little bookshelf full of them. But also, I count him among my few professional friends in this business, and we've had some great chats. And his latest book, which you also are aware that I have personally considered to be his best work yet, Attention Deficit Democracy, has just gone softcover. That's some sort of a kudo in the writing and authoring world. My first book was softcover, so I have. I never managed. I don't think I ever made the switch, but still, and we got a few of them here at the station, which I need to thank. Need to thank the publisher for Mr. and Mrs. Palgrave over at Macmillan, and we've given away several during the week. We will continue to give away a few as time permits. But I thought, hey, look, as long as the book went softcover, it'd be a good idea to get Jim back on the air here and chat a little bit about the book and what's happened, since he wrote it, because time marches on and things can and sometimes actually do change. So why not see if maybe that is the case here? So we gave him a call, and he's on the other end of this phone right over here. How you doing, James?
Hey, Brian. How's it going up there?
Well, it's a lovely day in the neighborhood. I don't know if it's nearly as exciting as it is in the People's Republic of Maryland, but as I understand it, you're still living out of gun range of Washington, D.C. streets.
Well, it depends on what kind of gun you're talking about.
Well, that is true. And, of course, there is that upcoming Supreme Court case that should be interesting.
Yeah, that's hopeful, and it should be fun to hear the weasels make the argument why government should be able to disarm us.
Indeed. Well, but of course you live in the free and independent state of Maryland, where the Second Amendment is highly respected.
Yeah. It's toilet paper.
Yeah, well, like I say, when you're dealing with a governor that especially the one you got right now, it's yeah. Well, let's move on.
I didn't vote for him.
That's a line from Monty Python, isn't it?
Probably.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I guess we could talk about whether or not it's fair to hold you responsible for the governor of Ohio.
Ye gods, yeah. Well, I didn't.
Wait. The mayor of Toledo. How about that?
Well, you see, that's one of the good things is that I don't live in an area where I could vote for him, so I can't take any claim either way on that. Although I will claim that. Thanks to the legal department at Clear Channel, the mayor learned at least a little bitty lesson in the sanctity of the First Amendment.
Well, and not only that, but thanks to your work and some of the PR from that, you have built his name recognition around the country. I mean, it probably hasn't boosted his speaking fees, but
No.
I mean, thanks to what you've done, people all over the country have laughed at that mayor.
Well, that's I couldn't ask for anything more. They're probably thankful that they don't live in the same jurisdiction with him either. I wanted to go through a couple of things in the book, Jim, because I've been through the book twice now. I've got folks, as a matter of fact, the lady who will be doing our traffic report here in about 10 minutes is I think about 3/4 of the way through the book.
Wow.
And
that's very unusual for a traffic reporter.
Well, she's very intelligent, perspicacious, and interested in things pertaining to liberty and freedom and the principles thereof, and
that's great.
How they apply to our country. But I wanted to take a couple of sections here. I think I got maybe a half a dozen of them earmarked, and in the 30, 45 minutes, whatever we've got to spend here, have you comment on them, especially in light of if indeed anything has changed between when you wrote these, and I know that you put an awful lot of these, that you don't just sit down and bang these things out, that they take a lot of cogitation and research and all the rest that goes along with it, and fear, yeah, that's a great motivator, especially when I look at about a quarter of an inch of footnotes here in the back and so on. So let me start here. Of course, the hardest part I've got is just getting out of the introduction, because there's so many thoughts in here that tend to be, if not foreign, at least unusual and probably never thought of by the average person who'll pick up the book. Here's the first one. It is a common saying among political campaign consultants, quote, in victory, all sins are forgotten, unquote. Unfortunately, the sooner citizens forget the lies of the campaign trail, the sooner they'll be victimized by new government failures and sacrificed in more unnecessary wars. Losing a certain percentage of the voters who understand issues or recall facts is now simply a transaction cost, quote unquote, for a political campaign. The only lies that are unforgivable nowadays are those that repel more voters than they con. And regardless of how brazen a politician's howlers, the media rushes to repaint him as worthy of respect and deference. We're going, unquote. Now that we're going into the silly season, it's officially underway and has been so now for way too many months. What do you think? Big change, no change, some change, or still pearls of wisdom?
Well, I'm really glad to see how well Ron Paul is doing. I mean, Ron Paul is by far the most honest major party presidential candidate in a long time. And the fact that he's doing gangbusters on fundraising is a very good sign. And Paul hasn't compromised. He's still out there with the same principles. Aside from Paul and some of the lower-ranking Democratic candidates that are good in the war, it's the same old stuff. I mean, it's a heck of a thing to think that this country might be governed for 20 years in a row by two political families who are widely recognized as being incompetent and corrupt. Because there's a good chance Hillary Clinton is going to win next November, and that would mean 4 or 8 years of her after 12 years of the Bush father and son. And it's interesting thinking back to Bush 1. I mean, he was basically laughed out of office with tar and feathers, and he wasn't thought of as being very honest, and he wasn't thought of as dealing straight with the American people.
Well, that's an excellent point, because we went from Bush to Reagan to Bush. I'm sorry, we went from Bush to Clinton, but Bush, Clinton, Bush, and we got Clinton. I mean, and I'm wondering maybe the reason for the rather blind mainstream media treatment of these two people, these two families, is that they're with Teddy being such a disappointment in carrying on the Camelot role of the Kennedys. And with the death of Princess Di, which is now being regurgitated with the release of the...
it's good to work that in.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying, we seem to just be focused on celebrity politicians and folks who bring reality to the forefront and want to discuss issues constitutional and rule of law and so on, like Ron Paul, get dissed and maligned and laughed at and so on.
Yeah, and it's interesting to watch the media kowtow to these leading candidates, be it Giuliani or Hillary or Thompson now. I guess the media is having a very difficult time pumping air into Fred Thompson because his audiences keep falling asleep, and it's kind of hard to hide. But it's fascinating that I'm not sure if it's because the media is lazy or if they're just ducking the issue, that the media does not want to focus on the fact of the U.S. Constitution is being shredded by president after president, and this is the fundamental issue. And instead of that, we're hearing about Hillary's cleavage or Giuliani's comb over and stuff like that. But but these guys and Hillary would as well if she gets in office. These guys have trampled their oath of office. They have scorned all the limits on federal power, and they are a growing menace.
Well, yeah, and of course I agree 100%. Review his book, Attention Deficit Democracy, that just is now available in softcover. And it's very attractive. It's great. What does that mean exactly, Jim? I mean, this is obviously the hardcover edition did so well. The Mr. and Mrs. Palgrave decided to make it available at a slightly lower cost and continue to exploit your talents.
Afraid that the softcover is a metaphor for my life.
Oh, okay, I got.
No, basically it means that it's sold well enough in hardback that they think that they can make some money by selling it in paperback, which is why they're spending, spending without stint on the massive advertising campaign.
I've really enjoyed the full page ads. Here is let me get this quote here. The more authoritarian the U.S. government becomes, the louder presidents praise democracy. Unfortunately, democracy is a magical word that permits speakers to automatically fog the minds of many listeners. By what standard could American democracy be considered a success? simply because referendums on rules occur without widespread violence, because most Americans acquiesce to whomever the political system ordains the winner, because the majority of people continue obeying and paying taxes, simply because there have not been Albanian-style mass violent attacks on government office buildings. Bogus fears can produce real servitude, unquote. We've seen some of that right here in Toledo, James. There's a real baseline, kind of like the bass line that occurs in some good jazz riffs and so on, that of fear of reprisals, fear of government thugs, union thugs, coming out if you dare to speak contrary to the will of the machine.
Well, it's good. It's good that you're speaking contrary to it. That they haven't taken you out yet, and that I hope your life insurance premiums haven't gone up.
Well, my life insurance premiums haven't gone up, but I'm sure spending a hell of a lot on ammo.
You always spend a whole lot on ammo. Even back in the 90s, you were.
Well, you're right about that. Yeah. Well, be prepared. You got to be prepared on that. But it does bring in the element of fear, and it seems to me that especially since 9/11, how much did we really have to be afraid of, and was of a legitimate concern, versus how much of it was bogus just to extend government control? Because we all know that there's nothing like a good crisis to let government reach its tentacles into other areas.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how easily the Bush administration. Well, Clinton did it as well. Clinton also fear-mongered a lot, but I think the Bush folks have raised it to a higher level, especially during his re-election campaign in late 2003, 2004. It seemed that the government had a lot of opportune terror alert warnings, terror attack warnings that turned out to be totally unfounded. Yet there was one study that found that each time the federal government issued a terror attack warning, Bush's approval rating rose by an average of 3%, and 3% was the difference in 2004 in the election. So,
well, I can tell you that after going back to Janet Reno's Waco barbecue, I sure as hell was scared.
Well, Waco was a real watershed for the It should have been the most important public education lesson of the 1990s, because it was obvious that the federal government would use extreme force against Americans, use it against women and children, and that when that happened, people could count on the media to put a halo and a crown on the head of the government official who sent in the tanks. I mean, it was one of the biggest disgraces of the Waco was the fact that the Washington Press Corps raced to make Janet Reno a hero afterwards, simply because she muttered something about responsibility in a Ted Koppel interview on the day after the tanks went in and pumped in the toxic gas and the flammable gas, and 80 people died.
Yeah, and I'm sure the survivors and the relatives of those dead felt so much better that Janet Reno took responsibility.
Well, but she really didn't do that, because I went back and read the transcript, and she was there was all kinds of garbage in there about basically justifying what they'd done and stuff that didn't hold up didn't pass the laugh test. And Janet Reno also tried to make sure the facts didn't come out about Waco, and she succeeded to a large part in delaying the facts for years. And we still don't know a lot of the key facts about Waco.
Yeah, or the missing. Well, yes, that is true. Of course, the really laughable part, I thought, was where she and Bill Clinton got into a tug of war as to who was going to take responsibility for it. No, I'll take. No, I'll take it. No, I'll take it. It was really kind of dumb.
Well, yeah, I mean, Janet Reno's not the kind of person to get in a tug of war with.
No, you're right. She's bigger than I am. Let me get to this next one here, because I found this one. I always found this one kind of interesting. Quote: Many people. This is a quote now for those of you just joining us from Jim's book, Attention Deficit Democracy, now available in softcover. Many people believe that the soaring popularity of political talk radio would boost voter literacy. However, quote, exposure to these programs is not significantly related to even elementary tests of political information, unquote, according to a Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media examination of the knowledge of regular talk show listeners. Well, yeah.
I was shocked and saddened by that one.
Yeah, well, so was I. But I'm just wondering, I think at least in our little world here in Toledo, and the stations that I've had the pleasure and privilege of being on around the country, that there is some small, you feel like Johnny Appleseed, especially like with you in this book. I mean, you know that it's resonating. There are people right here in this building, for example, who are thinking about things differently than they did a year and a half ago. There are people who are thinking differently now, having read Attention Deficit Democracy. So there's got to be some even small measurable progress being made in turning lights on around.
Well, I mean, but it's two separate issues. I mean, simply because people who listen to the Brian Wilson show end up with a better understanding of local politics or national politics doesn't mean that folks who listen to Glenn Beck or listen to some of the hosts out there who are very demagogic are going to get a better understanding. There was a survey done. University of Maryland did a survey that found that Fox News viewers were far more likely to hold mistaken beliefs about the war in Iraq than were people who got their news from PBS. And I'm not a big fan of PBS, but Fox News has been in the forefront of putting out false information on the war in Iraq and on the Middle East in general. And folks who have it turned out that folks who watched Fox, based on how much that they watched it, they were more likely to hold mistaken beliefs as far as weapons of mass destruction, as far as evidence linking Saddam to the terrorists, or the notion that other foreigners supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Folks who watched Fox News were basically hopeless on these issues, and it's a fascinating thing. There was a poll out a few weeks ago that showed that I think 1/3 of Americans still think that Saddam was behind 9/11, and if folks are that incorrigible, then it's unfortunate they have to vote because they apparently don't know how to read, or perhaps they don't read. But it's
maybe it's reading retention. Maybe that's the problem. Reading for comprehension and retention. I don't know.
If folks are that gullible, then it creates a huge block that politicians can exploit. That it makes it easy for politicians to demagogue and to frighten and to use this block in order to pressure the media to bury stories that would embarrass the government.
And that's one of the greatest points, that is brought out in the book that folks really need to know, and that is that once their attention deficit goes into overdrive, and they don't listen, don't learn, don't read, don't study, don't care, they just get all caught up in that contagious apathy thing. Then indeed, that's exactly the type of thing, and that these politicians will do. It's when you have solid factual information, and you watch debates or are listening to speeches or interviews or read articles, it is remarkable how transparent it all becomes, and that in and of itself is a little scary. But that's one of the big lessons that can be learned in attention deficit democracy. I was going to ask you, Jim, about in fact, we were talking a little bit. There is a portion of your book at the end of the chapter, Ignorance and the Mirage of Informed Consent, where you talk about it is a popular saying that people get the government they deserve, and this has rarely been more false than in current time. The fact that most Americans are politically ignorant does not entitle other people to control their lives, just as the fact that someone does not have fire insurance does not entitle his neighbor to burn down his house. Similarly, the fact that most people are politically negligent does not entitle people to trample to trample their rights, because individual rights do not come from government. Politicians have no right to revoke the rights due merely to people's negligence. There is an old saying that the cure for the problems of democracy is more democracy, but what is the cure for the problem of ignorant voters? Well, there's the question. What is the cure for the problem of ignorant voters?
Well, I think I've already used the beer joke.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there isn't any problem. Unfortunately, there isn't any solution, and because of that, this is why government. There is no way to make a government the size of the current federal government to make it work well. The only thing we can do is greatly reduce its power and then keep it on a leash. But this is almost nobody's proposing that now. Almost everybody's offering their various schemes to expand the power of government to create more pretexts, put more Americans in prison, and to make more Americans kowtow to federal agents. And this is going in exactly the wrong direction. And there is no simple solution to this current monstrosity.
Well, what about a starting point?
A starting point. Make the government obey the Constitution, or else throw the current politicians out.
Well, but haven't efforts been made to try and rein in a lot of these things? For example, I know that you've written a lot, and there's been a lot in the news on the use of torture or the alleged use of torture and so on. I mean, that's been a major component in political discussions with respects to the war on terror in this administration. I'm finding in most quarters, at least, that a rational discussion of that reality is exceedingly difficult because most people, based in part, I suspect, on the same factors that you referenced in the book that we just discussed, are perfectly okay with it. These folks attacked us. 3,000 plus people died horrible deaths. In planes and in buildings. And if somebody's getting smacked up alongside the head or having water poured over his head or something on that order, well, tough. It's a little difficult to mount a whole lot of outrage about that.
Well, it's unfortunate that people aren't making the simple distinction that the people that have been tortured were not the people that carried out the 9/11 attacks. A lot of people seem to think that as long as someone is Arab or Muslim, that's close enough for government work to torture them. New York Times has a great story today, front page, on how there was a secret memo that the Justice Department put together in late 2004 and again in early 2005 that authorized the CIA to go around beating the crap out of people around the world, and something which this new opinion authorized, first time it's become explicit, is that the CIA has been allowed to do head slapping, is what they call it, as well as simulated drowning, putting people at frigid temperatures, withholding food, stuff like that. And there's a verbal game that Bush and some of his top people like Gonzales have played, saying, well, it's not really torture because George Bush says so. But it goes against the entire meaning of what torture is meant under American law and international law. And not only that, but the CIA experts, the U.S. military experts, and others say this generates bogus information. People say, well, it's okay to take the risk. People should recognize that some of the key information that linked Saddam to Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups came from torture, a torture detainee, I believe, in Egypt, torture at American request. And Bush used this information to help justify the invasion of Iraq. And so we've got, in one sense, we've got thousands of Americans dead because of torture, because torture generated some of the false claims Bush used to attack Iraq.
Well, I've got all that. What I'm finding, though, in again, in attempts at rational discussion, is that there is a mindset that, well, it's okay because after all, they did these things to us. Al Qaeda is doing these things to us. We didn't. None of our soldiers cut anybody's heads off and put out a video on it. So anything that comes down on these things is pretty much okay as long as we don't sink to the same level that they do.
Well, I mean, it's interesting how people rationalize the barbaric practices of the U.S. government and the torture policy of the last 6 or 7 years, the last 6 years. More details are coming out on this. There are going to be other leaks. There are a lot of CIA agents that are now worried about how they could be prosecuted for torture. There are other Justice Department officials who are now sweating themselves because the shadow of indictment is starting to creep higher in D.C. because of these abuses. And I think we've still only seen the tip of the iceberg of what the U.S. government has done. And a major practical reason why the U.S. should not torture is because American soldiers who are captured in foreign wars could be subject to the same things that we're doing to foreign detainees right now.
Mm. Well, it's obvious you're just a rabble-rouser, and there's no real point in pursuing this any further.
Well, just a bleeding heart liberal.
There it is. But I do enjoy this one. I enjoy the whole book, but this one that I've gone to a couple of times. If people choose to make no effort to understand the machinations of government, then they have chosen to be political victims. If people choose to disregard past lies and abuses, they choose to sacrifice themselves to the next liar and abuser. And when you look at the unquote, and when you look at the polls, there's certainly one of the champions of liars and abusers waiting in the wings to take over the seat, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on. Once again, always an education and an inspiration to have you on the show. Congratulations on the paperback. We'll be awarding it to worthy listeners from time to time here at WSPD.
Well, thanks.
And I always Always enjoy getting together to yap with you here on the radio, Jim. Take care and have a cold one on me.
Hey, Brian, thanks for having me on. Thanks for the good laugh.
Always a pleasure. We'll talk soon. Jim Bovard, Attention Deficit Democracy. Great book.